received his degrees in chemistry and biology from Northwestern Oklahoma State University and spent some time as a research chemist focusing on lipoprotein studies. Really? That's amazing.
Those are important.
Jim worked in the oil and gas industry in Oklahoma and Texas as a chemist and manager for 40 years. Jim served as vice chair of the inaugural Shawnee Tribe Historical and Cultural Preservation Committee. And he'll tell us more about that, I'm sure. Jim is now retired, and he and his wife, Jerry, of 40 years, continue their love of family history and travel across the U.S., visiting historical sites related to their families. So I'd like you to welcome Jim.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I really am excited to give this talk. I've got some really interesting stories about my Shawnee family and then my European American family that some of them intermarried, and there was a lot of wars, as Kathy mentioned, that they were involved in. So it was really interesting as I found all of these connections. It's just almost dumbfounding. But so I'm going to go over those. Let me share my screen here if I can. I can move this out of the way. Can you see the?
Yes.
Let me move that too. Okay, hopefully you're seeing. Are you seeing it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so essentially we were doing research in genealogy and my family histories, and again, I appreciate the talk. This is my great-grandmother, Julia Ellick, and my great-grandfather, Dr. Bird. They married in about 1872 here in Oklahoma. So part of the story is going to be about them. I'm going to talk about where I started with my interest in genealogy, and then I'm going to kind of go through some of the steps that I took. I'm not going to bore you with how to do it because you already know, but there are a few things that I did that may be helpful, especially with the Native American research. So did that change? I hope it did. Okay, so I started about 1979 after watching this mini series called Centennial. It was a story about a French trapper, and then alternatively there was a story about some Arapaho family, and they ended up meeting each other out in the frontier. And this is after much later than Ohio stuff, but it was so interesting. It was really a kind of a breakthrough program at the time. They'd never done anything like this. It was 25 hours of once a week. They'd have an hour or two and had all the best actors in the year. So many of you may already have seen it, but people nowadays have not seen it. But it was really great. And it really got me to wondering what happened to where my ancestors come from. Who were they? Because I didn't know much. And then after that, I started reading historical novels, and I came across this Kent Family Chronicles, which was another type of historical novel. It was written to commemorate the 1976 200-year anniversary of the United States. And it followed a French boy who came to the United States fairly early on, and it chronicled his family throughout the whole 200 years. Another really interesting set of books that I really enjoyed. James Michener wrote Centennial, and he wrote a bunch of other books that on Texas and Chesapeake and others that I read those as well. So all of this reading, which I wasn't accustomed to because I didn't do a good job in high school, but I got into it, and it just really got me interested in my family. So that's about the time I started looking at what my family history was like. So I started in a little small library in Ponca City, Oklahoma. And they had a genealogy research department. And, those days you had to travel to various locations to get information. There was no internet. There was not much in the way of interlibrary loan. There was some, but that was like snail mail today. And so you basically traveled from one place to another. But it just so happened that since I was from Oklahoma, there was quite a bit of information on my native ancestry here that allowed me to get a good foundation and work towards other things and look in other places. So just a little bit of some of the sources that are available that you all know about. Family stories, those are pretty important because sometimes they seem far-fetched and sometimes you wonder, but a lot of the family stories that I've heard over the years, I thought were far-fetched, but they turned out to be true. It just was amazing that a family story will go from one generation to another and it's real. So those are the things that are something to look at. Census records, of course, obituaries, newspaper articles, other historical records, military journals, oral history interviews. In Oklahoma, they did quite a few oral histories. The WTPA, I believe, did it, and they interviewed a lot of the Native American family here, and there's quite a few of those on the Oklahoma Historical Society site. And it gives some good information about things that we don't know. So this was done in the 30s. And so they were talking to people that were elders from, say, 1860 and things like that. So there was good information on that. A lot of it was how they moved to Oklahoma from Kansas and so on. And then there's land records, immigration records. So with the Native Americans, you have Dawes records, which was the last real accounting of some of the tribes, and then treaties. I've got a number of people in my family that signed treaties, and then just general Native American records, and then also DNA testing that has become pretty useful lately. So I'm going to kind of talk about my family a little bit here, just kind of discuss the players, I guess, and how I kind of came about some of that. So one of the first things I happened to run across was this article, which was an obituary for my great-grandfather who was on that first slide. His name was Dr. Bird. He died in 1913, and it mentioned his children's names, of course, and things like that, but it also named some people that were living with him from Virginia, his nephew, and it mentioned my great-grandmother's name was Julia Ellick. She was the first one on the slide as well, and that she was Shawnee and raised by her uncle. And then there was a pretty extensive biography of Dr. Bird, who was originally from Virginia. So I still have this on my wall. It's a really great newspaper. And oddly enough, my grandfather, Albert Sidney Lee, was the owner of the newspaper, and he's the one who wrote it. So that was kind of nice as well. So when I started researching, first thing I came across, because I started looking at Shawnee or Native American stuff, was my grandmother. This is my grandmother here and my dad, and her name was Fitzhugh Lee Bird, and then she married a Lee, so she was Fitzhugh Lee, which was a little unusual, but this is my dad in 1911. But the first record I found on her was a Dawes record, which it showed her as Fitzhugh Bird, and she was 13. This was about 1905, maybe something like that, and says she was quarter, and then the rest of her family there. And so all her life she went by the name Julia, and it was because of her mother. Her mother died young, and so they hadn't named any of the daughters Julia, so they started calling Fitzhugh Julia. So that made a real problem when I started looking up death records and other records for her, because her name was Fitzhugh and it didn't match. So it was a bit of a struggle, but we got that all figured out. So this is back to Julia Ellick. She was my great-grandmother, and she was born 1851 in Kansas. and she died in 1891 of meningitis here in Oklahoma. And I currently take care of the cemetery that was all grown up, where she's buried was all grown up, and you couldn't even get in the fence. And my wife and I have cut down 300 or 400 trees that weren't very big, but they were totally smothered the cemetery. Now it's looks like a normal cemetery. A lot of Shawnee and Cherokee are buried in there. So Julia Ann Ellick was born about 1890, and she was a daughter of Bill Ellick and Mary Silverheel. And Bill Ellick was, we were told, a French trapper. I can't find out much of him at all, so I just don't know. Mary Silverheel was her mother, and she was a sister of Moses Silverheel, who ended up raising Julia. So Julia was orphaned when she was 2 or 3 years old. Both her parents died of what I think was cholera, because there was a big cholera epidemic that went through Kansas City, or Shawnee town, where they lived in the early 1850s. She was a great granddaughter of Silverheels, who was Cornstalk's brother. You may have heard Cornstalk, and Halema was Cornstalk's sister. They were brother and sister. And then in about 1870, she married a man named Frank Choteau. And the Choteaus were the fur traders that established St. Louis. They were from Louisiana, they were French, and moved up to St. Louis area, and they started fur trading, and became huge fur trading outfit. And Frank was their grandson, and his father and grandfather had big fur trading company in Kansas, the Kansas City area, which was Shawnee reservation, Shawnee land. And they had they traded with the Kansas Indians and the Kaw and the Shawnee, and real interesting time, about 1830s. But they got married, and he was on a trip to western Oklahoma on a buffalo hunt, and he got thrown from a horse and was killed. And so he was gone, and Dr. Bird had met Julia while attending Moses. Dr. Bird was a dentist, and he went to work on Moses' toothache or something, and he met Julia, and he kind of fell head over heels over her. And eventually, after Frank's death, they were able to be married. So some of the census records, I'm going to show you a few census records. They're a great place to get information. Of course, the last one available is 1950, which was just out. And some of the census records show where people were born, where the parents were born. That's really good information. There are some Native American records. They're a little harder to come by, but the Shawnee happen to have quite a few. Or in lieu of a census record, it may be a payment from the government. So there were quite a few of those that the Shawnee had. So here's the first census record I found of the Bird family. This is Dr. Bird right here. Julia had passed away already, and it shows Fitzhugh, or the daughter, my grandmother, on here. And it's listed as a son, presumably because they thought Fitzhugh was a boy's name. So you can't judge all census records with 100% accuracy, but we know who they were. So this was a special Indian census in Indian Territory. And this is a rare picture of the family. They had 7 girls and 1 son. And these are all the girls. This is about 1900 in Fairland. And Dr. Bird's over here on the left. This is my grandmother. She was probably 9 or so at the time that this was taken. And this is another picture of her about the same time with a sister. There were a lot of people that took these studio pictures of their kids and family in the Indian Territory. This was the Nita Indian Territory. And so it's another neat picture. Some of these pictures are kind of hard to come by. This was a census in 1865 of my great grandmother Julia Ellick, where she was living with her uncle Moses Silverheels. She was 15, and it's 1865 census. And so her cousins were George Silverheels, Nancy Silverheels, Mary Silverheels, and then the Blue Jackets are listed down here. This was a census of head of the household in 1842 and shows Bill Ellick and a family. Don't know that that's him. Don't know that that's his family, but presume that it is. And this was Bill Ellick. I'm getting a lot of feedback from somebody.
Yeah, we're gonna go ahead.
If there's anybody online that is not muted, please do so now. I've tried muting all of you except Jim and me, and we're still getting some chatter. So please mute. Here we go. Thank you.
Okay, this is a record that I found with Bill Ellick's name on it. And in 1833, the federal government was trying to push the Seminole out of Florida, and they were having a hard time. Seminole were pretty good fighters, and they asked the Shawnee, or they hired the Shawnee, a bunch of Shawnee men, to go to Florida and fight the Seminoles. And it was basically kind of like a mercenary group. They took them down there and they fought. I don't know if there was much in the way of battles, but I think there was some. And so Bill Ellick was listed with them. And if he was a French trader or trapper, I just can't believe he would have been doing that. So again, I can't find out anything about him or his family, so I'm at a bit of a loss. But again, he was with the Shawnee as early as 1833. So that's a pretty neat record to find. And this was a record with Silverheels on it, not Silverheels. So Silverheels, Cornstalk's brother, had a son that he named Silverheels, or took the name Silverheels. So he's Silverheels Jr., I guess. And that's his name listed on here. This is a treaty of Fort Meigs after the War of 1812. The Shawnee gave up all of Ohio, and they established three reservations at Wapakoneta, Hog Creek, and Lewistown. And this is division. What they did, they divided 48 square miles with these people named in this right here. So there's about, I think there's about 40 names or so. So Silverheels had a equal portion of land with all of these other Shawnee people mentioned in the treaty. Another really good record, official type record. And then some of the other sources, of course, newspapers, oral histories, affidavits. I have some affidavits that I have are nice, and just a regular record. They help fill out the story that you're looking for as you're doing genealogy. So this is kind of a tree that shows Dr. Bird here and Julia here. This is my dad right here. And so they have the Ellicks, which disappears, or you can't go any further here, but it has Silverheel. So Julia's mother was Mary Silverheel, whose father was Silverheel, whose grandfather was Silverheel's, Cornstalk's brother. And then over here, a note is Dr. Bird's mother was named Elizabeth Polson. And I don't know if her father was named William Polson. I have a record or a written note in a journal that he was William Polson. And there's some stuff I want to talk about later about that that's kind of interesting, but you might just remember that. So I'm going to get into the Shawnee history just a little bit, but I'm going to go through places that my family were involved in, that I know they were involved in through records and through history. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the Shawnee history. As you know, they were mainly in the eastern part of the United States, mainly Pennsylvania, some down as low as Florida, even possibly. But in the old days, they were mostly on the coast, and so early on they interacted with William Penn. They lived in that same area. The Lenape formed a treaty with William Penn where they sold some land to him in 1683. It was really the first treaty where anyone had purchased land from the natives, and the Shawnee were involved in that. And there was a lot of years of peace at that time. They really liked the Quakers, and they liked the whole situation was really good. But then some more Europeans came in, and they started pushing the Shawnee further west. And Cornstalk many years later, said that the Quakers were the only people that ever treated the Shawnee fairly, and it's probably fairly accurate. But eventually, the Shawnee decided to leave Pennsylvania and head west back to Ohio, which was their traditional homelands. So just a little bit about who these players are. So Silverheels was my fourth great grandfather. One of the funny things about my family is most of the men in my family did not marry until they were in their 30s. So the generations, this doesn't sound right, but the generations is right. It's weird. Like my grandfather was born in 1882. My great grandfather was born in 1836. And I'm not that old. I was born in 1955. So, and my dad was born in 1910. So it's just funny the way the males in our line married so late that the generations are. I'm one generation off from my wife's family, I guess. Anyway, Silverheels was a well-known warrior, and he was present at a number of the treaty signings. He's mentioned in quite a few historical documents. All I know is he had the one son. I'm sure he had other children, but he had the one son that was my third great grandfather. He adopted a white captive that was named Sarah Silverheels, who married some men in eastern Ohio, and their families out there, but their families show no native DNA, so we feel like she was probably a white captive. This was during the Northwest Indian Wars, and then she married these two men, and they lived around Beverly, Ohio, eastern part of Ohio. I think it's eastern. And there's an article by Richard Walker, who wrote this article, Where is the Legendary Silverheels? Really informative. You can find it online, and it's just a long dissertation about Silverheels, and his Indian name was Monakwane. And then Cornstalk, I'm sure you all are aware of Cornstalk. He was chief, mainly a peace chief, and he did, when the fighting was going on, he led warriors against raids against white settlers and during the French and Indian War in Virginia. And then he led the Shawnee in the Battle of Point Pleasant, 1774. After that battle, he negotiated the Treaty of Camp Charlotte. And then he was murdered at Fort Randolph in 1777. He was there on a peacekeeping trip, but ended up getting murdered. I'll go through that later. And Non-Halema, or Grenadier Squaw, as she was called, was their sister, and she was an interpreter, a warrior, a peacemaker, and she lived at Fort Pitt for quite a few years. And she translated over 400 Shawnee words to a Major Ebenezer Denny at Fort Finney. And I've got that, I have a book with that in it. You can still buy it. And I'm taking Shawnee language classes or have been, and a lot of those words are in there. It was, but those are 1780 words for sure, 1786. She had several children, and she was married to Indian agent Alexander McKee, who was very prominent in the history books, as well as Richard Butler, Colonel Richard Butler. She was a chief and had her own town at Circleville on the Scioto. So the Shawnee leave Western Pennsylvania, moved to Ohio, like I mentioned. They had a lot of years of peace, but then with the more encroachment of the white settlers, they just decided to move and go back to Ohio. And they lived in various locations, Lower Shawnee Town, which is Portsmouth now, Cornstalk and Grenadier Squaws Town, which is near Circleville, Old Chillicothe, or I guess Old Town, what you call it, which is near Xenia, as well as they lived near Johnston's farm at around Pequot. So one of the records that is really interesting I found was that when the Shawnee were in around Fort Pitt and in Lower Shawnee Town, they were providing deer skins and other skins to the French and the British at different times. And this is an accounting by the British of goods brought into Lower Shawnee Town by Shawnee people. And this has blue jackets. He brought in 12 bucks and he was paid 4 pounds, 10 shillings. And it's got silver heels on here. And what he brought in, corn stalks down here. He wasn't very busy. He only brought in 1 buck. Now his mother and sister. So his mother was named Elizabeth, and she lived with the Moravians at, I believe it was at Gnadenhutten, but I can't remember for sure. But anyway, and his sister presumably was not Halima. But that's a kind of neat record to find of, written by the British. They kept all kinds of records. It was really interesting. So I'm going to kind of go through some of these things that happened from this point on that are of interest that I know my family was involved in. So you're all familiar with the French and Indian War. There was all kinds of fighting off and on between the Native Americans and Europeans after first contact. If you look at the history from 1650 to this point, there's wars and there's peace, there's wars and there's peace, and it continued until Battle of 1812, essentially. So there was fighting between France and England, who were both claiming land in the eastern part of the United States, east of the Mississippi. And the French and Indian War was kind of a culmination of a bunch of fighting that had been going on. The Shawnee sided with the French to stop the expansion. They felt like they were better equipped to stop the Europeans from coming in to their land than the British. They didn't care for the British. Cornstalk Silverheels were in the thick of it. They were listed as having attacked settlers along the frontier on quite a few occasions. Some of it wasn't very pretty. So it happened on both sides. So the first battle of the French and Indian War was at was around Fort Necessity. So in 1754, George Washington was tasked with building a road from Virginia up to the forks of the Ohio, and they were trying to get rid of the French at Fort Duquesne. So Washington was also told that if you run across any French to take them out, because they wanted to push them as far away from Ohio as they could. Well, he came upon a group in at this Fort Necessity area, and he had his men attack them, and they killed quite a few of them. They killed one of the main leaders. The French really got mad when they killed him. They thought they targeted him, and so George Washington was building this Fort Necessity, and about a month later, the French came down from Fort Duquesne and attacked Fort Necessity. Well, Fort Necessity was nothing more than a stockade that housed their equipment, foodstuffs and things like that. It wasn't a fort like you would think it, where it protected the people. Well, that's not what it was. And the fighting in those days were the Americans, militia, they'd fight like this picture shows. They'd just stand out there in the middle. Well, the Indians were out here in the trees popping them off, and it didn't work out too well for Washington. So Washington had to surrender and leave the area. Well, the interesting thing about this is there was a Captain William Polson, if you remember that name, who was a civil engineer of the time, and he was leading the Virginia regiment and was helping to construct the road. So he was involved in that, and that is, according to this note I found in this journal, it had a little bit of information about him. He was a great-grandfather of my great-grandfather. So he goes back a ways. I haven't actually found the documentation yet. I just found out about this a few months ago, but I have a feeling it's probably true. But again, I haven't documented it all yet. So after Fort Necessity, again, this fighting was still continuing. There was a battle of Monongahela. I'm going to go through that a little bit. I just read this book after finding out about Polson, and this was a really interesting book. It's a fairly new book, and it details the battle, and it's very detailed. A lot of quotes from people in there, and a lot of good references. That this man did a lot of research on it. It was really interesting. So in early 1755, the British government sent over General Edward Braddock and 2 divisions of British regulars that they had never sent over before. This was the first time they'd sent to the colonies a group of troops to do battle. So they were working on taking care of the French. And so these regiments were actually from Ireland, and they had been doing battle there. And so they brought them over, and Braddock was with George Washington, who was involved. Again, they were going to build a road from Virginia up to the Fort Pitt, or the Forks of the Ohio, and try to take Fort Duquesne. So again, Captain William Polson led the engineers and the construction crews through the forest. And you know what the forest looks like up there. I cannot imagine going in there with an axe and trying to build a road through there, but that's what they did. And this book explains a lot about the road building and the trials and tribulations they had on that. Is quite impressive. So also there was a John Polson, which was Captain William Polson's brother, who was also involved in the construction crew. So I got 2 people, presumably, that are involved in this. So the battle itself, there was about 2,000 British regulars. They didn't have any natives with them. They couldn't talk the natives into helping them, but they had colonial militia from Pennsylvania and some from Virginia, farmers, wagoners, and they left Cumberland, Maryland on May 29th, and they started through building a road to Fort Duquesne. So during the time, they kept thinking they were going to be ambushed by the French, and it didn't happen. They got all the way to Monongahela, which is just south of Fort Pitt, before they ever got any wind of the French. They knew they were coming, but the funny thing was, since they had no opposition, and in their minds, with their British soldiers, they were going to be able to wipe the French out. It wasn't even thought of that there was any other way of an outcome. So they're going up there, and they just had a false sense of security. Well, when they got just over the Monongahela, the French attacked them, and French had 1,600 forces, about 1,600. Where they were Shawnee and some other tribes, and they just about slaughtered the British. The British were down in a bottom where they're building the road, and they had a few people up on top, and then the French, Canadians, and Indians came from in front of them, and they just start picking them off. And then there was quite a few hand-to-hand combat, but mostly the Indians were shooting from behind the trees. The British soldiers were just standing out there in the middle. They had never been in that kind of a battle, and they didn't know this. They didn't know how you fought in the United States, and so it was kind of ugly. One of the Shawnee, not one of the Shawnee, one of the Indian leaders had said to somebody, a quote, that the British were stupid, that they were standing there shooting their guns at their hips, just pointing at the enemy rather than aiming at them. And they said, we hide behind a tree and shoot at them, point, aim at them. And so anyway, Braddock was mortally wounded. He got shot and he died a few days later. The entire British force, which included Daniel Boone and Daniel Morgan, they were wagoners. They all fled the battlefield. They retreated back to Fort Cumberland as quick as they could. The Indian warriors, they didn't show any mercy. They killed as many as they could. They killed or wounded over 800 British and American soldiers. There were some women along with the group. About a dozen were killed, and they took a number of them captive. And Captain William Polson was killed by friendly fire. There's a quote in there that he was trying to tell the Virginia or the British to aim at somebody, not just shoot in the woods. And they said the next volley he got shot, killed. And then his brother John was shot several times, and he ended up having 3 bullets in him that he carried the rest of his life. So this is still part of the French and Indian War. The Shawnee and Delaware attacked Fort Upper Track. So Washington had commissioned a number of forts to be built along the Potomac and just on the boundary. I don't know that area very well, but just on the boundary between Virginia and what's now West Virginia. And there were a number of forts built there for the settlers. And in 1758, leading French, Shawnee and Delaware forces captured and burned Fort Upper Track, killing all the inhabitants. And my 5th great grandfather, John Hutchison, who was a Scottish immigrant, was among those killed in the fort. There was about 22 people, I believe. The French and Indians then attacked Fort Siebert the next day, killing a number of settlers. And at that point, they took a bunch of captives. But at that point, at Fort Upper Track, they didn't know who attacked that. But when they went to Siebert and somebody lived to tell the story, they were able to know that it was Shawnee and French that did that. So my 5th great grandfather, John Hutchison, had a land patent there somewhere right around that area. I've got a map of it. And his daughter, whose name was Isabella, married my 4th great grandfather, whose name was Ephraim Wilson. He had land there too. And there was a comment in some journal or something I saw that they believe that Ephraim Wilson and his family moved further south to get away from Indian problems. So I guess that's probably a good reason. So after the French and Indian War, which culminated in the Treaty of Paris, the French basically gave up Canada and Louisiana territory. And so they said, okay, we're leaving. And Britain claimed all the lands east of the Mississippi. Well, the Native Americans who were involved in all this were left out of the treaty entirely. They weren't even consulted on anything. It was just between the French and the British. And so they weren't really happy. They lost effectively most of their homelands. But the British, trying to pacify the tribes, declared the Appalachian Mountains the proclamation line of 1763. And it forbid white settlement across Appalachian Mountains, west of Appalachian Mountains, other than traders. You could get a license to trade there or trap there. So that was supposed to solve all the problems. So after some years of peace, about 1774, the renewed hostilities happened, and due to more white encroachment, the Americans wanted to live west of the Appalachians. They knew that it was good land, and they didn't care about the Indians being there. So they decided to move and encroach more. I mean, this is, see where this is going. It's always the same thing. So the European settlers would attack Indians on the frontier. Once they found them, they'd attack them, kill them. And then the natives did the same thing. They would find a group of what were going to become Americans, and they would attack them and kill them. And then all the war started up again. So Chief Logan, who was a Mingo chief, he was Cayuga at birth, was a leader who was really a peacekeeper. He really tried to keep the peace. He was a good friend of the British. In 1774, based on all this friction that was going on, some frontiersmen came upon Logan's family at Yellow Creek on the Ohio, and they enticed them over across the river, and they got them drunk. And after they got them drunk, they killed them all, and happened to be a number of Shawnee and Logan's family. Logan wasn't there, but his family was there. They killed everyone in his family and some Shawnee. And when Logan found out about it, he and his warriors went on a killing spree all across the frontier. This was 1774, I think. So, in response to this Fortitude of Silver Heels is an article that I found in the 70s. A cousin of mine, Shawnee cousin of mine, found this article, and it's about Silver Heels, and it's a 4 or 5 page article about him and this story that I'm going to tell you about. We couldn't find the magazine again, and for 40 years, my wife ran across it on eBay, and we picked it up. We were able to pick it up, and I didn't have a copy of it. Now I do. So, and have reread it many times. Very interesting. So a group of fur traders were with the Shawnee at Scioto, and they'd heard about Logan's murdering spree, and Logan decided he was going to find these traders anywhere along the frontier and kill them. He was on just a revenge spree, and Cornstalk wouldn't hear of it. The traders were trading with him, and they came on in peace, and they were good people. And Cornstalk, who again was kind of a peacemaker, he wouldn't let them be harmed. So he sent Silver Heels with several other warriors to escort them back to Fort Pitt. It was 250 miles, and they went and took some. They didn't follow the main roads, which you probably weren't any then anyway. But they escorted them back to Fort Pitt. And Richard Butler, who was Non-Halima's husband at one point, was with them. And so once they got to Fort Pitt, the commandant, John Connolly, who hated the Native Americans, decided he was going to kill Silver Heels and his men. And he sent some men out to ambush them. And Richard Butler had found out about that, so he told Silver Heels to skedaddle, and he left. But he didn't tell Silver Heels that he was going to be attacked. So Silver Heels and his men kind of leisurely made their way down the Ohio to leave, and this group of Virginians attacked them at mouth of Beaver Creek on the Ohio, and they fought a little bit, and Silver Heel was shot in the chest right through a lung and wounded pretty severely. And the militiamen thought there might be some other Indians in the area, so they hightailed it back to Fort Pitt without finishing their job. And so Red Hawk, who was a young Shawnee warrior and was with Silver Heels, he was trying to get Silver Heels back to Cornstalk's town. And then Silver Heels was hurt pretty bad, but he was bound and determined to get back. So they carried Silver Heels about 80 miles. They went to Schönbrunn, which was a Moravian town, on their way back. And missionary John Heckwelder looked at Silver Hills and said he didn't think he was going to make it, that he couldn't help him. He wasn't a doctor, and his wound was really bad. And so Heckwelder wrote in his journal that when he saw him, he said, I just think he's not going to make it much further. Silver Hill asked to be taken to Wakatamika, which was a Shawnee town about 50 miles further. And there was a medicine man who actually ended up taking care of Silver Hills, and he recovered. And then John Heckwelder, who said that he didn't think he'd make it, said he saw him several more times in Detroit, and that he had dinner with him as late as 1793. So this happened in 1774. And so Silver Hills was still alive up to 1793. In 1774, again, due to all this conflict, Cornstalk and 1,200 Shawnee and Mingo and Delaware decided to attack the American militia. It was basically Virginia militia, and it ended up happening at Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And they said that Nonhalema, Blue Jacket, Red Hawk, Puxin Chinois, Black Hoof Logan, and several others fought in that battle. Puxin Chinois, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, was Tecumseh's father, and he was killed. And I heard Silver Hills took place or took part of the battle. He was wounded in early 1774. This happened in October, and that he'd recovered. I haven't found anything certain on that, but that's what I understand. So they fought for about a day at Point Pleasant, and then the Shawnee were kind of getting the worst of it. So they retreated back across the Ohio and went back to their town, and they decided that peace was the best thing. Cornstalk didn't like the fighting anyway, but so the Treaty of Camp Charlotte, which Camp Charlotte is down around Circleville, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, down around Circleville. Basically, Cornstalk gave up all land south of the Ohio River, which was essentially Kentucky, and they basically said they would not molest any settlers on the Ohio or south of the Ohio River, and then everything be good. They didn't want them coming across, and so that's kind of a major point. But they gave up that part of it. So these are some weapons that were recovered by a man named Captain Philip Love. After the Battle of Point Pleasant, the Virginia militia went and they took all the trinkets and weapons and stuff off the dead Shawnee warriors that were there, and they auctioned most of them off somehow or another. But this Captain Philip Love, who was the head of this group, he kept some of them for himself, and they've been in his family since 1774. Well, they've come up for auction in the last few years, and I've been able to pick some up. And this was a weapon. This was actually called a fro knife, but it was used as a weapon. This is a knife that was used. There's another knife that's almost identical to this that they had for sale that was Tecumseh's father's knife. And it looks exactly like this, except these nick marks are a little different. They're almost the same. It took me a while to make sure that this wasn't. So he had two knives like this. And then these are trade beads that they picked up, the Shawnee picked up, and they wore on their clothes. And so just got lucky to find these, and I picked them up. I'm going to give them to the tribe. It's our cultural center probably at some point. So after the Battle of Point Pleasant, they had a few years of peace, but the settlers kept encroaching. They were coming across the Ohio. They wouldn't give up, and some of the Shawnee wanted to just leave them alone, and others, the younger ones especially, wanted to fight, push them back. And Cornstalk, he was trying to keep the peace. He wanted to keep the Treaty of Camp Charlotte the way it should have been done. So he went to Fort Randolph, which had been built after Battle of Point Pleasant, and told them that he could not keep his warriors from siding back with the British in fighting the Americans. And so the leader at the fort decided he didn't like that, and he arrested Cornstalk and Red Hawk, who happened to be with him. And then a few days later, or maybe sometime later, Cornstalk's son, Elenipsico, visited the fort to find out why Cornstalk hadn't come home. And the next day after he was there was a frontier or a militiaman that was killed along the Ohio River near the fort. And the other militiamen assumed that Elenipsico had brought in warriors and they had attacked the man and killed him. And Elenipsico said that wasn't the case. But in a fit of rage, several of the militiamen attacked Cornstalk's cabin, where he and Red Hawk and Elenipsico were in the cabin, and they shot and killed them all. So this is another article, Tragedy of Point Pleasant, that I found that details that pretty well. So later, it just keeps going. It's never ending. The British and Shawnee attacked Ruggles Fort in Kentucky in 1779. That's just north of Lexington. And the British regular army, led by Captain Henry Byrd, led about 1,000 warriors. Many Shawnee attacked Ruggles Fort and Martin Station, killing several settlers and then taking over 400 prisoners. This was what the British were trying to get the Indians to raise cane in the frontier to make the British or the Americans have to fight on two fronts. They were fighting the British in the East due to the Revolutionary War, and they were also trying to get them to split their troops, basically, to fight in the frontier as well. And so that was the start of this. Henry Byrd took some cannon with him, and this was the first time that cannon had been used in the frontier. He shot a couple of shots at the fort, just kind of warning shots, and Isaac Ruddle, who was the commander of the fort, realized that they could take the walls down real easy. So he asked to surrender if they would promise they wouldn't kill anybody. And when they opened the gates, some of the Indians went in and killed some people, and they took all these captives. Some of them they took captives and took them back home. But there were about 400 prisoners that the British marched to Detroit, and then they were sold to the British in Detroit. So how does that relate to my family? Well, Isaac Ruddle, who was the fort's leader, was married to my first cousin, 6 times removed, Elizabeth Bowman. My fifth great-grandfather was named Cornelius Bowman. That was his first cousin. And I happened onto this doing some research on somebody in our cemetery, had no relation to me, just something my wife was asking about. So I started doing research. Well, when I was doing it, one of them said that I had a DNA match with them. And I thought, why is that? And so I got to looking at it, and the name was Ruddle in their tree. And so I started researching it. Well, sure enough, they were Ruddles. And as I worked through that line, realized that it was her name was Bowman, and that's my great grandmother's name was Bowman. And so turned out they were cousins. Their son, Stephen Ruddle, was captured. He was about 12 when he was captured. And he grew up with Tecumseh's family, and he fought alongside Tecumseh against the whites for about 15 years. When they grew up, they basically became Shawnee, and they fought with the Shawnee. So he fought with Tecumseh for a number of years. Now, on top of that, Elizabeth Bowman's brothers, all of them served with George Rogers Clark. George Rogers Clark was trying to beat the Shawnee and the natives. He was on the American side, and so they were attacking Shawnee towns and stuff like that. And so one of the brothers, Joseph, actually fought at Point Pleasant. And Ruddle's Mill, this is their, the Ruddles are buried at Ruddle's Mill, which is just the town right near where Ruddle's Fort was. My wife and I have been there a couple times. So the Bowman line, so there's a George Bowman who came from Europe, and his wife, Mary Height, raised these children, a bunch of daughters and sons, in Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. And John Jacob, who was one of the sons, fought Indians in Kentucky and was killed in the Revolutionary War. Elizabeth married Isaac Ruddle. And Major Joseph Bowman was second in command under George Rogers Clark, fought at Point Pleasant, and was killed at Vincennes. Another brother, Abraham Bowman, was command of the 8th Virginia Regiment, with his commander was Captain Matthias Height, who was probably an uncle or cousin. Isaac Bowman was captured, was with Clark, and he was captured by the Indians at some point in 1779, and he's had some horror stories to tell about that, but he escaped. And then Colonel John Bowman attacked Shawnee at Old Chillicothe, where you guys live, and burned down Old Chillicothe. He didn't do it with George Rogers Clark's blessing. He did it on his own, but it led to the death of Chief Blackfish in 1779. And then John Bowman was also in a regiment with Captain Philip Love, who's the one that picked up those beads and those weapons at Point Pleasant. And I've also found records where they're together in Virginia. They served as justices of some court together, so they knew each other fairly well. The Bowmans have a distillery now in Virginia, and they make Bowman Brothers whiskey. You can't see it, but behind there's showing the frontier, the Bowman Brothers standing in a frontier, like a Daniel Boone setting. It's I got some bottles of this, kind of interesting. So I think this is my last story. I'm getting close to the end. So later on, after that war, was the Northwest Indian Wars. So there was, again, time of peace and now time of war. And there was, again, killings on both sides. Well, there was a white settler named Abel Sherman who was living near Waterford on the Muskegon, and they were living in a fort, and he went out looking for a cow, and his fellow people in the fort told him not to go out there, but he was kind of headstrong. He went out. Well, it turns out that the Indians used to steal their cattle, and they would push them away from the fort, and it would entice the settlers to come out of the fort and look for their cattle. And so they did that. So Silverheels did that. So he and two others had moved the cattle, and this Abel Sherman came out of the fort looking for him. Well, he went downstream a ways, and then he went back, and on his way back, he saw some ripe apples. So he started picking May apples, and he started putting them in his shirt. Well, that's when Silverheels and his men came upon him, and they attacked him. They were going to take him captive. Well, when Sherman saw him, he turned his gun on him. He shot one of them in the shoulder, and then Silverheels shot him, killed him. But according to what I read, was Silverheels wasn't intended to kill him. They were going to take him captive. And so the Silverheels grabbed the guy's musket, and the fort heard the shooting, and he knew that they'd be coming after him. So they took off running, and then he said the musket was not of any use to him. So he stuck it in the hollow of a dead tree, and they took off running. Well, a few years later, after the end of this war in 1798, things were pretty much friendly again between the natives and the whites. He came across some men that were making salt somewhere, and they gave him some liquor and started talking to him. They knew who he was. He was fairly well known at that time. And so he started bragging about his war, what he did in the war. And he was talking about how he killed that man that was gathering May apples. And oddly enough, the man's son was in that group of men, and he was sitting there listening to him, and Silverheels described the musket correctly. And so the son went back to where the man was killed and found that musket, or what was left of it, it had deteriorated in the tree of that dead tree. And so they realized that he was telling the truth. Well, not too long later, a month or so, they found Silverheels, or some people found Silverheels dead in his camp, which was near Stockport. And so that's,
I'm gonna be doing that interview. for
that
you.
was basically
Okay.
the end of
I can do it in the kitchen, or I can do it.
Silverheels, as we know.
Would be better for
Basement.
the basement. Okay.
Thank you.
And this is
We
the
have a whole round.
Yeah.
Ed, please mute.
People frustrate you. Did they go too slow?
What's that?
Did they golf too slow? Did you get mad? Did they golf too slow? Did you get
No.
mad?
I don't think she does.
so this is the rifle barrel that is in this campus Mardia's Museum in Marietta. And they also have Abel Sherman's tombstone in there that they had made another one. I haven't been there. I'm going to go and see that. But so one last slide about history. Johnson's Farm, we were up there last November, I think, and they had just reopened the house, and I got a personal tour by the curator there, whose name happened to be Height. So we're probably related somehow or another through the Heights. But Blue Jacket, Black Hoof, and a number of other Shawnees lived up there or near there, or came back and forth. They visited John Johnston at his Indian agency. They really liked him. And George Blue Jacket, which was Blue Jacket's son, was schooled there, and he wrote a journal. He wrote a lot of nice things about John Johnston. So that's a really neat place to visit. So that's kind of all my stories, which are kind of extensive. There's probably others, but I'm going to finish off with a little genealogy, a little DNA testing. If you're familiar with DNA testing, there's several different methods. It really has helped a bunch in my research, since there aren't a lot of Shawnee records, and of course, there's no birth certificates, death certificates, that kind of thing. It's just some census records. This has helped put some pieces together that I wasn't expecting. So there's several different types of DNA testing. Autosomal, which does both your mother and your father's DNA, and then the Y-DNA, which is just your father's side, and the mitochondrial, which is just your maternal DNA. So both the Y-DNA takes into account all of your fathers from way back. The father passes his Y-DNA to the son unchanged every generation, and it's same as the mother. It doesn't change other than a mutation here and there. So it's kind of interesting. So one of the things that that I wondered about was when they have the names of Shawnee, that you get the father's name or the husband's name, but you generally don't get the wife's name. Mary Silverheel, who was my great-great-grandmother, was the last woman that I know about. And I know she was full blood, or I thought maybe she was full blood. But there was a comment in Kansas that they didn't think the Silverheels were full blood. So what I wanted to do was find out if there was any white captives in our line. Well, I had a cousin do her mitochondrial DNA because she's a daughter of Mary Silverheel. So she would be the only one that'd be able to take it. So she took it, and she found out that her haplogroup is called X2A, and it's one of the most rare, it's one of the rarest haplogroups in the world, and it's almost only found in Native Americans. It's found in 3% of all Native Americans, so it isn't common, but it's found in 30% of the Ojibwe tribe. And there's a lot of Ojibwe. and apparently some of them, or quite a few of them, have taken the test. So it's very possible that my third great grandmother might have been Ojibwe. The Shawnee and the Ojibwe lived together, lived near each other, fought in the same battles and all that, and they were all in the same general area at different times. So it's entirely possible that she was Ojibwe, not Shawnee. I actually have a couple of Ojibwe matches up in Canada that they don't know who their ancestors were any better than I do at that point. So we just know we're cousins. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting thing, but it doesn't say it basically says that the X2A isn't found in Europe. So it's not a European family that came over and ended up making the Ojibwe tribe. It's different than that. So they're not real sure. So some of my DNA relationships that I found that I did not expect were Blue Jackets. I've got a bunch of Blue Jacket family that I didn't know I was related to. There's no documentation. There's no known Silver Heels Blue Jacket marriages prior to about 1850. We know of some after that, but not before that. And then I also have Spybuck, who was a well-known Shawnee Indian, and Tecumseh. I have Tecumseh cousins, I have descendants of Tecumseh, and the Shawnee Prophet as well, who was Tecumseh's brother. And a lot of these matches go back 5 to 6, 7 generations. So they're way back. What I think may have happened is Chief Blue Jacket married a woman named Ms. Babby. They don't know her first name, but her father was a French trader in Quebec. His name was Jacques Babby, and the mother was Shawnee. And so this girl would be Porter, I guess. Yeah. Anyway, it looks like it's possible that this Miss Babby's mother might have been a Cornstalk or a Silver Heels in order for all of this to work right. And that's my guess. I don't know yet. But then the other thing that DNA, there was the story that Blue Jacket was actually a white captive named Marmaduke Van Sweringen. Well, they did studies between both the Van Sweringen's family and Blue Jacket family descendants. There's no relationship between the two at all. It's impossible that they were related. So that's a busted theory, myth. And that's all I have. I don't know if you've got any questions.
What was the time frame of the Johnson agency?
You know, I haven't studied that a lot, but it was, I think it was around the 1830s.
Okay.
Well, it was actually earlier than that. I'm sorry, probably 1810 to 1830, because the Shawnee were gone. They left Ohio in 1830. But it was, I believe it was after might have been late 1790s, now that I'm thinking about it, because it was after Northwest Indian Wars. I don't know specifics, I guess, on that.
Thank you.
Jim,
I did want to mention, I have a friend from the Netherlands who's on here, and she is a Shawnee aficionado. She learned about the Shawnee when she was a young girl, probably 60, 70 years ago. And she was here in the United States. She traveled through Ohio, Pittsburgh, Ohio, and then came to Oklahoma, and she stayed with me a week, and I took her around to see some Oklahoma sites. But she wanted to hear my presentation, so she's watching live from the Netherlands. So hi, Anna.
We had a question here.
Jim, did you say you were a member of one of the Oklahoma tribes?
Yeah, I'm a member of the Shawnee tribe. It was called the Loyal Shawnee. so there's three distinct Shawnee tribes. There's the loyal, the eastern, and the absentee, and they kind of split up around the Northwest Indian Wars. The one group left. They got tired of all the fighting. They went to what was the Louisiana Territory, or turned into Missouri, around Cape Girardeau, Missouri, south of St. Louis. That was actually my family, I think, went there. And then the others were moved to Kansas, and then they moved to Oklahoma. That was my group. So
Is Ben Barnes your chief?
he is, yes.
Do you attend council and ceremony?
Yes,
Great.
Yeah, I was on the first Shawnee Tribe Cultural and Historical Preservation Committee that we formed a few years ago. And we did a bunch of stuff. I did a lot of stuff in Kansas because Kansas City was more my area expertise. And we were doing some things up there. And then we started on the Xenia, the center that's being built in Xenia, or Old Town. And I worked on that for a little bit, but then I dropped out due to some other stuff I needed to do.
So you know Talon Silverhorn from Glenna Wallace's group?
Talon, yeah. I've never met him, but yeah, I know who he is. And Jeremy Turner, he's another one that's
Yeah, Jeremy.
He was on the committee with me. He and I are good friends. He lives up in Indiana, and but Talon was one that he works for the state now of Ohio, and he's doing a lot of that work in there, from what I understand. Real good guy.
Have you been up to the Battle of the Thames site up near Chatham, Ontario? Have you been up that way yet?
No, I don't have a passport, but I would like to go up there. I don't know if I will, but it would be nice to go up there.
Are you planning on coming back this way anytime?
Say that again?
Are you planning on returning to Ohio?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We would have come this time. I really wanted to do this in person, but my wife's mother, who's 90, had surgery just recently, and my wife didn't want to leave her. And so I just decided I'd do it remotely. But yeah, I want to go up and see the new interpretive center when it gets built.
It's still a bunch of metal and plastic coating, so they're not done yet.
Hi, Jim, this is Ken Binzer, and I'm real interested in your Y-DNA analysis and so forth that you were looking at. I'm sort of a fanatic in this particular area, and they are discovering now that the Native American Y-DNA is actually rather ancient, more so than even the European. And of course, they're looking at the Bering Strait path of migration at that particular time of coming down through North America from Russia. Russia, what it is today anyway.
Yeah.
And coming in and actually, so it even predates, they're figuring, although there's a lot more studies to be done, that the Y-DNA for Native Americans, and of course down into Central and South America as well,
Yeah.
Actually came from the Bering Strait and not from Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what this X2A looks like. It is not from Europe. And now I'm not, my Y-DNA is Lee, so it was, he's English, or we're English, so it was so I don't have anything on that, but my autosomal does show traces of matches with the Kennewick Man and Clovis, Montana, which were 8, 10, 12,000 years ago, that were two skeletons found in the western part of the United States. So yeah, it's really interesting. DNA, since I was in science all my life, a lot of people think it's hocus pocus, and a lot of the natives are scared of it and all that. And so, whatever, but it's really great science. It's really interesting.
It's very real. Now, I gotta preface my next comment, you don't get to pick your ancestors. So I am presently doing a Y-DNA study with my son-in-law, and his name is Lumpkin. That may mean something to you
Mhm.
because he is a cousin to Wilson Lumpkin of the state of Georgia at the time, and was the administrator of moving the Cherokees from that particular part of the time, based on Andrew Jackson's assignment,
Yeah,
and moving them to west of the Mississippi. So,
right.
but I'm doing his DNA with several others of his particular area, and it's working out very well as far as the Y-DNA. It does prove the fact that these particular branches of the family do in fact connect to a common ancestor. So it's well worth pursuing if you're.
Absolutely.
And also, the other hand of that is, it also will destroy a lot of genealogy that has been done over the years, and people think they are of one surname and they are not. They are actually the surname of another. And I have one of those cases in that study as well, to where it's probably going to destroy this lady's 40 years of genealogy.
Yeah, well, it's,
All of a
yeah,
sudden, Lumpkin, and they're not what they thought they were.
yeah, it can be, it's not always good news. My wife, her maiden name is Weed, W-E-E-D, and her father seemed to think that some ancestor was adopted. And so there was kind of a dead end at well, not too far back prior to the Civil War. So I had her brother do a Y-DNA test a couple months ago, and we found out that there is not Weed, that it's Duval or Devol, D-E-V-O-L, and he has 5 matches that are fairly close. But now we've got to try and find out where that comes from. You know, what are the what's the ancestry to that? So it proved that it was not a weed, and now it's looking at, okay, what is it? And we may not, we know it's Duval, but we may not be able to figure out what family particularly it came from. But yeah, I've helped several people that were adopted find their parents and stuff like that, and that it's really it's quite amazing.
It is. Why, by the way, Y-DNA is on sale by Family Tree DNA.
Yeah.
I have no affiliation with them, but for the entire month of August, it's on sale.
Yeah, well, I actually had him or paid for the autosomal, because now with the Y-DNA, we're going to have his autosomal to try and see if we can find more matches that go together. So yeah, but since it came on sale, I went ahead and did that. And yeah, it's really quite interesting.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome.
Anyone else got a question for Jim? You have to unmute. All quiet here, Jim. I think you're all the hook.
Hi, Jim.
Oh, wait.
You have a question?
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Anna. How you doing?
Oh, that's
It was so good to see you and to listen to you. And well, I made some notes from the things that I don't know. And well, it's hard to see you. I miss you too.
Missed you too, Anna. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, we will see each other maybe next year, because I am going to visit some places in Pennsylvania and Virginia that I want to see, and of course in Ohio.
Okay.
I'm not ready with this. I must know more, and I must find out why on earth that I love the Shawnee tribe so much. Where does it come from? and you talked about the DNA, and I searched in here for the DNA, but it cost me 500 euros, and that's too much because that for that money I like to travel. But there is something else I heard, and that is when you know someone that is a Shawnee, and you can have done the DNA, that you can find out if you are related to that Shawnee. So
Yes.
is that correct?
Yes, it's possible. Yeah. You have to do
And
some
then-
triangulation. You might have to do 2 or 3 people, because it just, if
Yes.
you match me, doesn't mean you necessarily a person that you match in the Shawnee. It could be Bowman or height or something else. So it's not quite that simple.
No, I know. I can find in here not so much about my ancestors. That's difficult, but
Yeah.
easy. And anyway, it doesn't matter so much because the love for the Shawnees is in my heart. And that's even more than on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
Are you agree with me?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Thanks, Anna.
Okay.
All right.
Yes, have a nice evening.
Okay, thank
Give my
you.
love to Jerry.
I will. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. I will send you this PowerPoint as a PDF if you want it.
Yes, of course, of course.
Okay.
I would love to.
And then that way you can distribute it if you like, Kathy.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes. Yes.
How many chapters from the Netherlands? Wow, I looked at 9. 9:15 there.
Where's my recorder?
Is that right, Anna? It's 9:15 there?